tengo el honor de presentar a Leda Cosmides, que la conocí años atrás. Lo que ella ha hecho es muy relevante para lo que es el razonamiento y emociones. Ella fue directora del Centro de Psicología Evolucionaria de la Universidad de California en Santa Bárbara. Está en visita aquí, la conocida está de Álvaro Piche, sigue llegando, felicitando la Universidad de importante y del desarrollo. Va a dar también un seminario una semana que pensado pueden contactarse con Cecilia sobre otros seminarios privados. Y en particular para la enseñanza y aprendizaje creo que es muy relevante lo que hace, lo que nos puede decir, en particular sobre cómo es que razonamos. Y se acerca un poco a la parte del tributo más parecido a lo que ella hace, lo que hace James Spencer de parte de nuestra vida. Tiene bastante por lo que hace ella. Así que
Okay, thank you. If I start to talk too fast, just go like this and you can tell me. What I'm going to do is I want to first spend a few minutes talking to you about evolutionary psychology as a general research framework, as a way of approaching psychology. And then I want to give you an example of a particular research program that comes out of this that has to do with reasoning about social exchange and cheater detection. So forgive me, because for the beginning part, I'm going to use some notes so that I don't go all over the place. And
slowly.
Yes, okay. So in the final pages of The Origin of Species, after Darwin had presented his theory of evolution by natural selection, he made a very bold prediction. He said, "In the distant future, I see open fields for far more important researches. Psychology will be based on a new foundation, that of the necessary acquirement of each mental power and capacity by gradation." So there were various attempts to integrate evolution into psychology, but it required some developments to happen in the rest of science. And so more than a century later, there was a group of scientists, John Tooby, who's my collaborator and husband, myself, Martin Daly and Margot Wilson, actually another husband and wife team, Don Simons, David Buss, Steve Pinker. We tried to begin to work out exactly how Darwin's fundamental insights could be used as a foundation on which to build a more systematic approach to psychology. And we were motivated by new developments in several different fields. The first and really the most important was the cognitive revolution. This is the main thing that was missing before. It provided a very precise language for describing mental mechanisms as programs that process information. The second was advances in paleoanthropology, hunter-gatherer studies, and primatology, which provided data about the adaptive problems that our ancestors had to solve to survive and reproduce, and the environments in which they did so. The third was research in animal behavior, linguistics, and neuropsychology, showing that the mind is not a blank slate, passively recording the world. Organisms come factory equipped, if you will, with knowledge about the world, which allows them to learn some relationships very easily, and others only with great effort, if at all. So B.F. Skinner's hypothesis that learning is a simple process governed by reward and punishment was just wrong. And the last was evolutionary game theory, or basically the revolution that placed evolutionary biology on a more rigorous formal foundation of replicator dynamics that clarified how natural selection works, what counts as an adaptive problem as opposed to any other kind of problem, and what the criteria are for calling a trait an adaptation. What we thought was that if one was very careful about the causal connections between these disciplines, these new developments could be pieced together into a single integrated research framework in a way that had not been exploited before, because it involves the connections run between fields instead of just cleanly within fields. And we call this framework evolutionary psychology. The goal of research in evolutionary psychology is to discover, understand, and map in detail the design of the human mind, as well as to explore the implications of these discoveries for other fields. The eventual aim is to map human nature, and by human nature I mean the set of reliably developing species-typical, the set of species-typical programs that reliably develop in the human brain, the architecture of the human mind. So, like all cognitive scientists, when evolutionary psychologists refer to the mind, they mean the set of information processing devices embodied in neural tissue that are responsible for all conscious and non-conscious. Could I ask just a little favor? Could you do that like in about 10 minutes? Because when I abandon all notes, it'll be fine. I appreciate it. Thank you. I was suddenly finding I couldn't think. So by the mind, people mean the set of information processing devices that are embodied in neural tissue that are responsible for all conscious and non-conscious mental activity and that generate all behavior. And like other psychologists, evolutionary psychologists test hypotheses about the design of these information processing devices, these programs, by using laboratory methods from experimental cognitive psychology, social psychology, neuropsychology, experimental economics, cross-cultural field work, whatever method is most appropriate to the problem that we're addressing. But what allows evolutionary psychologists to go beyond traditional approaches in studying the mind is they make active use in their research of what's an often overlooked fact, at least in psychology, that the programs that comprise the human mind were designed by natural selection to solve adaptive problems faced by our hunter-gatherer ancestors. Problems like finding a mate, cooperating with others, hunting, gathering, protecting children, avoiding predators, and so on. Natural selection tends to produce programs that solve problems like these reliably, quickly, and efficiently. So knowing this allows one to approach the study of the mind like an engineer. You start with a good specification of an adaptive information processing problem. And you can do this using information from evolutionary game theory, from hunter-gatherer studies, paleoanthropology, all of these different sources. Then you do a task analysis of that problem, asking yourself, well what properties would a mechanism that's well designed for solving this problem need to have? What kind of program would be able to solve this problem well? That allows you to when you use that as a kind of a discipline to your research, it allows you to derive new testable hypotheses about programs that might exist in the human mind that maybe nobody thought to look for before. And then you test them. You test them using all the standard methods that people use in all of psychology. At some point, when it looks like maybe there is, you're onto something, and maybe you're finding a new mechanism in the mind, a new kind of program. You want to also, at some point, it's nice if you can test for its neurological basis, and also you want to test cross-culturally because you want to see, well, what parts of this mechanism are buffered against cultural variation, and which ones are more free to vary across cultures. And our students, now former students, a lot of them, have maintained a site in the Ecuadorian Amazon for years where they take different psychology tests to see about their generality. So from this point of view, there are very precise causal connections that link the four developments that I was just talking about into a coherent framework for thinking about human nature and human society. So first, each organ in the body evolved to serve a function. The intestines digest, the heart pumps blood, the liver detoxifies poisons. The brain is also an organ, and its evolved function at its most general level is to extract information from the environment, both the internal environment of the body and the external environment, and use that information to generate behavior and regulate physiology. So from this perspective, the brain is a computer. It doesn't have the same design as this computer that you're working on. It has a different kind of architecture, but it's a computer in the sense that it's a physical system that was designed to process information. Its programs were designed not by an engineer, but by natural selection, which is a causal process that retains and discards design features on the basis of how well they solved problems that affected reproduction. The fact that the brain that the brain processes information is not an accidental side effect of some metabolic process. The brain was designed by natural selection to be a computer in this sense. So if you want to describe its operation in a way that captures its evolved function, you need to think of it as composed of programs that process information. The question then becomes very straightforward. What programs are to be found in the human brain? What are the reliably developing species-typical programs that, taken together, comprise the human mind? Second, individual behavior is generated by this evolved computer in response to information that it extracts from the internal and external environment, including the social environment, the cultural environment, of course. So to understand an individual's behavior, it's not good enough to just say the environment made me do it. Because yes, the environment made you do it. But you need to understand both the information that the person registered from the environment and the structure of the programs that generated his or her behavior. A human and a dung fly are going to behave in very different ways to the same stimulus. You know, dung flies fly around. Okay, not what we do. Right? Same stimulus in the environment, different behavior caused by different circuits in the brain. The programs that comprise the human brain were sculpted over evolutionary time by the ancestral environments and selection pressures experienced by the hunter-gatherers from whom we are descended. Each evolved program exists because it produced behavior that promoted the survival and reproduction of our ancestors better than alternative ones that arose during human evolutionary history. So evolutionary psychologists, it may be puzzling, but the reason evolutionary psychologists emphasize hunter-gatherer life is because the evolutionary process is very slow. It takes thousands of years to produce a program that's of any complexity. So when I'm talking about something complex, think about the design of the eye as your model for complex, many parts that have to fit together in just the right way. Natural selection can move quantitative things like how tall you are, things that can happen over shorter periods of time. But any complex mechanism that has a lot of integrated parts, that takes a long time for selection to build. And the Industrial Revolution, or even the Agricultural Revolution, which is much older, are eye blinks in evolutionary time. They're just too short to really have selected for new cognitive programs that have complexly functionally integrated parts. Fourth, although the behavior our evolved programs generate would on average have been adaptive, that is reproduction promoting in ancestral environments, there's no guarantee that they'll be reproduction promoting now. They may or may not be. You just don't know. There's no way to know in advance. And I'm not sure it's an interesting question. Modern environments differ very importantly from ancestral environments, particularly when it comes to social behavior. So we no longer live in small, face-to-face societies, bands of about 200 people, many of whom were close relatives. That's the situation that most of our ancestors, the social world they faced. Yet our cognitive programs were designed to negotiate that social world. You see more people in one day than as you walk across a campus than your typical hunter-gatherer probably saw, in a lifetime or maybe in years. It's very different. And then perhaps, and this may be the most important thing, you would expect our brain to be composed of many different programs, each specialized for solving a different adaptive problem our ancestors faced. That is, the mind cannot be a blank slate. So why? The same thing, I would argue the same thing is true of any computationally powerful multitasking computer. So consider whatever computer you work on. There's so many people that analyze data and that also write papers, write prose, that most computers, when you get them, they're equipped with a spreadsheet and a text editor of some sort. These are two separate programs, each with different computational properties. That's because number crunching and writing a good paper are very different problems. The design features that make a program good at data analysis are just very different than the ones that make it easy to write with, right? And vice versa. I mean, you could imagine, trying to write a paper in Excel or whatever your favorite data crunching program is. It would be awful. And obviously in Word or something like that, you can't analyze data. Each is good for its task. So to accomplish both tasks well, your computer has two different programs, each well designed for a specific task. And the more functionally specialized programs your computer has, the more intelligent your computer is. That is, the more things that it can do. And I would argue that the same is true for people. Our hunter-gatherer ancestors were, in effect, they were on a camping trip that lasted a lifetime, and they had to solve many different problems well to survive and reproduce under those conditions. Design features that make a program good at, for example, at choosing nutritious foods, will be ill-suited for finding a fertile mate. Different problems require different evolved solutions. I am not married to a big chocolate bar. Right? My criteria for mates is just very different than my criteria for foods, and it's hard to beat chocolate. So this you can see this most clearly by using results from evolutionary game theory and data about ancestral environments to define adaptive problems, and then by carefully dissecting the computational requirements of any program that's going to be capable of solving those problems. So, and this is what I'm going to use in the example, it turns out that programs that are designed for logical reasoning, insofar as we have programs that are designed for carrying out the computations of first-order logic, turn out to be very poorly designed for detecting cheaters in social exchange, and vice versa. And as I'll show you, it looks like we have programs that are functionally specialized for reasoning about reciprocity and social exchange. Lastly, if you want to understand human culture and society, you need to understand these domain-specific programs, in addition to whatever more domain general programs might exist. The mind is not like a video camera that's passively recording the world but imparting no content of its own. So this camera over here, it's just recording me. It's not interpreting me. It's not adding inferences. It's not. Our minds are not like that. Domain-specific programs organize our experiences, create our inferences. They inject certain recurrent concepts and motivations into our mental life. They give us our passions, and they provide cross-culturally universal frames of meaning that allow us to understand the actions and intentions of others. They cause us to think some very specific thoughts. They make certain ideas, feelings, and reactions seem reasonable, interesting, and memorable. Consequently, they play a key role in determining which ideas and customs are going to spread easily from mind to mind and which will not. That is, they play a crucial role in shaping human culture. Now, instincts are the old-fashioned word instinct. People often think of instincts as just the opposite of reasoning. In fact, people will sometimes talk about humans as a rational animal, and they'll say things like, what natural selection did is it erased all of our instincts and it replaced it with reason with a big R. But the reasoning programs that evolutionary psychologists have been finding are complexly organized for solving an adaptive problem. They reliably develop in all normal human beings. They develop without any conscious effort. They develop without any formal instruction. You don't need to go to school to learn these inferences. They're applied without any awareness of their underlying logic. You apply these inferences, but you don't necessarily realize what inferences you're making. And they seem to be distinct from more general abilities to process information or to behave intelligently. In other words, they have all the hallmarks of what we usually think of as an instinct. In fact, one can think of these specialized circuits as reasoning instincts. They make certain kinds of inferences just as easy, effortless, and natural to us as humans as spinning a web is to a spider or building a dam is to a beaver. I want to give you just a really simple example from Simon Baron-Cohen's work. This is the Charlie task. So this is, you say to your typically developing 3 or 4-year-old child, you say, this is my friend Charlie. And you just ask them, which candy does Charlie want? The typical 3 or 4-year-old will point to this one, the one that Charlie's looking at. Right? Now, so that's fine, and that seems straightforward, that he wants one he's looking at. Now, it doesn't seem like there's anything to be explained, right? But if you ask a person with autism that same question, their answers will be random. They might point to all 4 candies. They might point randomly to any one of these candies. They give a random answer. But, and this is the really important thing, if you ask a person with autism, which candy is Charlie looking at, they'll say this one. So they know, they can compute eye direction. They know which candy Charlie's looking at, but they don't use that information to make an inference about a mental state of wanting. Okay? The circuitry that allows that inference just did not develop normally in them. Right? That's the kind of inference that we make so naturally, and you would think, oh, won't your experience of the world tell you this and so on. We make that so easily and naturally, it doesn't seem like there's anything to be explained until you see something like a developmental disorder like autism. And then you realize, wait a minute, There's machinery that causes that inference, and it can be broken, or it can develop improperly in the first place. It wakes you up in a way to things that you didn't realize existed in the world. So as a species, we've been blind. This is what I mean by a reasoning instinct. When I say reasoning instinct, this would be an example of very simple inference that we're designed to make. And I think as a species, we've been blind to the existence of these instincts, not because we lack them, but because they work so well. Because they process information so effortlessly and automatically, their operation just disappears unnoticed into the background. They structure our thought so powerfully that it can really be very difficult to realize, to imagine how things could be otherwise. How could you not think something like that? How could you not make an inference like that? As a result, we take so-called normal behavior for granted. We don't realize that normal behavior needs to be explained at all, but it does. So, for example, every day you engage in trade. You go to Starbucks, you want a mocha, you ask them for one, they give you your mocha, and you give them money. You've engaged in trade, in an exchange. And we take for granted the fact that by exchanging goods and services, people can make each other better off. But this kind of cooperation for mutual benefit, known in evolutionary biology under different names, reciprocity, reciprocal altruism, social exchange, that's not common in the animal kingdom. Although it's zoologically rare, you do sometimes find it. It has evolved in a variety of species, from vampire bats to baboons, indicating that some species have evolved the cognitive programs necessary for engaging in this behavior, while others have not. So the research that I'm going to tell you about, that we've been doing over the course of years, suggests that the programs that allow social exchange to proceed in humans are specialized for that function, and they include a subroutine that one can think of as a reasoning instinct, as an instinct that causes a certain kind of moral reason, which you can think of as moral reasoning, the detection of cheaters. So, one of the reasons we started with social exchange is because there's reason to think that the selection pressures for social exchange have existed for a very long time. It's universal and highly elaborated across cultures, presenting itself in many different forms, reciprocal gift giving, food sharing, market pricing, and so on. It does not appear to be a recent cultural invention, like the alphabetic writing system, rice cultivation, computer programming. If it were, you'd expect it to find evidence of it having one or several points of origin and it having spread by contact from place to place, and of it being extremely elaborated in some cultures and absent in others. The way you find writing. You don't find writing everywhere. Right? And you find it very elaborated in some places and not at all other places. Instead, social exchange seems to be a very ancient, pervasive, and central part of human social life. There's fossil evidence that indicates that social exchange may extend back at least 2 million years in the hominid line. And the fact that it exists in some of our primate cousins suggests that it may be even more ancient than that. In other words, situations involving social exchange have constituted a long, enduring selection pressure on the line that led to our species. So let's, for the sake of this research, let's define a social contract as a situation in which one's obligated to satisfy a requirement of some kind, often at a cost to oneself, in order to be entitled to receive a benefit. The requirement's imposed because its satisfaction creates a situation that benefits the party that imposed it. So if I say, if you give me your watch, I'll give you $100, I'm offering to give you a benefit, $100, in exchange for something that I consider to be an even bigger benefit to me, your watch. Otherwise, I wouldn't make the offer. Right? And you're only going to agree to my offer if you'd rather have the $100 than keep your watch. So a well-formed, or grammatical, if you will, social contract expresses an intercontingent situation of mutual benefit. To receive a benefit, an individual or group is required to provide a benefit. Usually, but not always, one incurs a cost by satisfying the requirement, but that cost is outweighed by the benefit that one receives in return. So social exchange is an I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine principle. Now cheating, I'm going to define cheating as a violation of a social contract. A very specific kind of violation. A cheater is an individual who illicitly benefits him or herself by taking a benefit without having satisfied the requirement that the other person made that benefit contingent upon. So So what counts as cheating depends on your perspective. So if our agreement was, if you give me your watch, I'll give you $100, I cheated you if I accepted your watch, but I did not give you the $100. Right? And you cheated me if you accepted my $100, but you did not give me the watch. Now, this falls into, you can express this if-then statement, the social contract, as an if P then Q statement. And from the point of view of logic, if P then Q is always violated when P is true, when P happens but Q does not happen, by P, the combination of P and not Q. Right? But if you think about it, this case of me cheating you, that is P. I've color-coded it, right? Purple, like I accepted your watch as P here. And not Q, I didn't give you the $100. I mean, when I cheat you, I didn't give you the money, and that happens to be not Q, me not giving you the $100. But the case where you cheated me, obviously, if you took my money but you didn't give me your watch. But now that's you accepting my $100, that's Q. That's in the then clause. So I'm going to use P to refer to whatever's in the if clause and Q to refer to whatever's in the then clause. Here, this is Q in the then clause, and you not giving me your watch is not P. Right? This is not a logically correct answer. Right? But this one is. So, let's talk about reciprocation and conditional reasoning. So if P then Q is a conditional rule, I'm just going to stick this over here. And then I'm going to take this big fake, my constructed podium. Okay. I'll take that down. Reciprocation is by definition social behavior that's conditional. Right? You deliver a benefit conditionally. That is, conditional on the other person doing what you required in return. So understanding it requires some form of conditional reasoning. So studies of conditional reasoning can serve as a test case. You can ask, what kind of reasoning instincts govern how we think about social exchange? Well, for example, formal logic, first order logic, for example, has rules of conditional reasoning, like modus ponens and modus tollens, if you follow logic. And so you can ask, in reasoning about social exchange, does the human mind apply reasoning procedures that embody a formal logic like that, a formal logic that's content-free and domain general, i.e. applies across domains no matter what the subject matter is? Or does your mind apply reasoning procedures that are specialized for social exchange, that are domain-specific and content-rich, that are well designed for reasoning about that domain, but may not apply outside that domain? Another way of putting it is the cognitive machinery that causes good conditional reasoning general. However we reason about conditional rules, do we have procedures that operate well regardless of content, which would be a blank slate type of theory? Or do our minds include cognitive machinery that's specialized for reasoning about social exchange alongside other domain-specific mechanisms, each specialized for reasoning about a different adaptive problem involving conditional behavior? So in our research, we started with an experimental paradigm that already existed, that had been developed by Peter Wason to study conditional reasoning. It's called the Wason selection task, and we used this to test a lot of hypotheses. So you need to experience a Wason selection task. So let me read it to you. So this is a typical one. This is not a social contract, but this is an if P then Q rule. Ebbinghaus disease was recently identified and is not yet well understood. So an international committee of physicians who have experience with this disease was assembled. Their goal was to characterize the symptoms and develop surefire ways of diagnosing it. Patients afflicted with Ebbinghaus disease have many different symptoms: nosebleeds, headaches, ringing in their ears, and others. Diagnosing it is difficult because a patient may have the disease, yet not manifest all the symptoms. Dr. Buchner, an expert on the disease, said that the following rule holds: if a person has Ebbinghaus disease, then that person will be forgetful. Dr. Buchner may be wrong, however. You're interested in seeing whether there are any patients whose symptoms violate this rule. The cards below represent 4 patients in your hospital. Each card represents one patient. One side of the card tells whether or not the patient has Ebbinghaus disease, and the other side tells whether or not that patient is forgetful. Which of the following card or cards would you definitely need to turn over to see if any of these cases violate Dr. Buchner's rule? If a person has Ebbinghaus disease, then that person will be forgetful. Don't turn over any more cards than are absolutely necessary. So here's a patient with Ebbinghaus disease. Do you need to turn over that card? Yes, good. Here's a patient who does not have Ebbinghaus disease. Do you need to turn over this card? No, right? Because this person could be forgetful. But that wouldn't violate the rule. They could have Alzheimer's disease. They could have they could be my age, right? And that doesn't violate the rule. There's possible causes of being forgetful. This person's forgetful. Do you have to look at the other side of this card? You guys are slower to answer. I see heads saying no, and right, you don't need to look at this card. And here's somebody who's not forgetful. Do you need to look at this card? Yes, you do. Because from the point of view of first order logic, this rule is violated by any time you find somebody with Ebbinghaus disease who is not forgetful. So this has the general form, if P then Q. From the point of view of logic, it's violated whenever P happens and Q does not happen. People do mostly realize that you need to turn over the P card, the one with Ebbinghaus disease. They mostly realize you don't need to turn over not P, this one. A lot of people think you do need to turn over this one. And about half the people don't realize you need to turn over this one. So if you look at how many people choose the P card, the not Q card, and no other cards, the answer is, amongst undergraduates, for example, only 26% will choose P, not Q, and no other card. That does not make us the poster children for logical reasoning. That's not great performance for logical reasoning. And if you're wondering, some of you are probably logic jockeys, and you're wondering if it's interpreted as a biconditional, and the answer is no, because if it were, you'd choose all 4 cards, and that's not what people do either. If you don't know what I just said, that's okay, it doesn't matter. But if you know what I'm talking about, you understand. Okay, so now I'm going to show you a problem that has the same surface structure of if P then Q, but I predict that you're going to find this one more straightforward. Teenagers, this one is a social contract, right? Teenagers who don't have their own cars usually end up borrowing their parents' cars. In return for the privilege of borrowing the car, the Goldsteins have given their kids the rule: if you borrow my car, then you have to fill up the tank with gas. Of course, teenagers are sometimes careless and irresponsible. You're interested in seeing whether any of the Goldstein teenagers broke this rule. The cards below represent 4 of the Goldstein teenagers. Each card represents 1 teenager. One side of the card tells whether or not a teenager has borrowed the parent's car on a particular day, and the other side tells whether or not that teenager filled up the tank with gas on that day. Which of the following card or cards would you definitely need to turn over to see if any of these teenagers are breaking their parents' rule? If you borrow my car, then you have to fill up the tank with gas. Don't turn over any more cards than are absolutely necessary. Do you need to look at the person who borrowed the car? Yeah. What about the person who did not borrow the car? No. What about the person who filled up the tank with gas? No. Is it more obvious now why you don't have your... I mean, this kid might have borrowed the car. They might not have borrowed the car, but be a really nice kid. Right? They may be confused, right? But they can't have cheated. They can't have cheated. And what about this guy? The person who did not fill up the tank with gas, if they borrowed the car, then they would have broken the rule, right? That's again, if P then Q, that's P and not. And now 76% of the same undergraduates get it right. So 26%, 76%. This is the kind of thing you don't even need statistics to know that's different. So the claim that I'm making, and that I'll present evidence for, the claim that I'm making is that the mind interprets that problem in a particular way, as a social contract. That the mind translates rules like that into representations of benefits and requirements, and it inserts concepts like entitled to or obligated to, whether they're specified in the rule or not. So the idea is that if you borrow my car, then you have to fill up the tank with gas. Given what people know about their local culture, they see that as having the structure: if you take the benefit, then you're obligated to satisfy the requirement. A person is cheated when they've accepted the benefit, but they have not fulfilled the requirement. And we're designed to look for cheaters. So a person who accepted the benefit and did not satisfy the requirement. In this case, that happens to be P and not Q. And so the idea is not that suddenly you reason logically, but it looks like you're reasoning logically because the correct choices to detect cheaters happen to be the logically correct answer in this case. But I'll show you a case where that's not true, and where people look for cheaters, they don't follow logic. Okay? So So the question we were asking is, do people have cognitive adaptations that are specialized for reasoning about social contracts? And in particular, do they have inference procedures that are specialized for cheater detection? So we use this paradigm to study human reasoning, and there was already a large literature that showed that people are not good at detecting violations of conditional rules in general, even when those rules deal with familiar content drawn from everyday life. So if you think about the Ebbinghaus problem I showed you, the one about the disease and the symptom, we're very used to the idea that a disease causes symptoms. There's nothing unfamiliar about that idea that a disease causes symptoms. But people are not good at detecting violations of rules like that. You can make the rule something very, very familiar to them, and it's just a descriptive rule, an indicative rule, a rule describing some relation in the world, like blondes have more fun. If you're blonde, then you have more fun. It doesn't matter. People are not good at detecting violations of them. So to start out, we wanted to see, to show that people who ordinarily cannot detect violations of conditional rules can suddenly do so when the violation represents cheating on a social contract, would be initial, not ending, but initial evidence that people do have, that they might have reasoning procedures that are specially designed for detecting cheaters in situations of social exchange. So when we did a task analysis, we asked, well, what kinds of design features would programs that are good at detecting cheaters for reasoning about social exchange, what design features should they have? Well, there should be a subroutine that makes you good at detecting cheaters. Familiarity of the rule should not be relevant, as long as you can interpret it as a social contract. Why? Because you don't want to just understand all the situations you've already experienced. You need to understand new opportunities for exchange as they arise. So even if it's somewhat unfamiliar, if somebody's making you an offer, you have to decide, do I want to accept this offer, and what would count as cheating, etc. We thought that it would embody an adaptive logic that does not map onto first-order logic, for example. Benefits and costs should be relevant, whether the rule involves benefits and costs, because it's not even a social contract if there's no benefit involved. It should matter for reasons I'll explain later, whether it's cheating versus an innocent mistake. The violation is cheating or an innocent mistake. The definition of cheating that your mind applies should depend on your perspective, like I was saying with the watch and the money. And there should be cross-culturally, the development of the cheater detection procedure should be buffered across cultures. You should see it in very different cultures. So let's go design feature by design feature, and at the same time try to eliminate alternative hypotheses as we go along. So the first thing we did had to do with familiarity, because familiarity should not be relevant. So we made one of the weirdest rules that something no undergraduate has ever heard before. If a man eats cassava root, then he must have a tattoo on his face. We used a set of rules that were like this. So what we did was we kept this rule constant, and we varied the context surrounding the rule. We made a Wason task, the 4-card task, where the cards are ate cassava root, did not eat cassava root, has a tattoo on his face, does not have a tattoo on his face. And we varied the context. So in the social contract context, we said it was set in a fictitious Polynesian culture that we just totally made it up. And we said among the Kalawame, cassava root, they think cassava root's an aphrodisiac. Everybody wants cassava root. And molo nuts, they don't like, they're nasty and bitter, and they don't really like molo nuts. Having a tattoo on your face, if you're a man, having a tattoo on your face means you're married. Having no tattoo means you're not married. The elders are concerned with sexual mores, so they've made the rule, if a man eats cassava root, then he must have a tattoo on his face. The cards below represent 4 men around the campfire. Which ones would you need to turn over to see if any of these men are violating this rule? So at being an aphrodisiac, that's a benefit, and access to the benefit is being restricted by you have to meet this requirement. So it fits the template for a social contract. And a cheater would be somebody who's eating cassava root but has no tattoo. In the descriptive context, for an indicative rule, if you like to think in logic terms, we give it a story, but there's no rationed benefit. And the rule purports to just describe behavior. So we say, among the Kalawame have 2 staple foods, cassava root and molo nuts, equally good foods. Having a tattoo on your face means you're married. Having no tattoo means you're not married. It happens that the married men live on the side of the island where the cassava root grows, and the unmarried men happen to live on the side of the island where the molo nuts grow. And you hear people saying, you know, if a man eats cassava root, then he must have a tattoo on his face. And you wonder about this and you think, well, maybe this rule just expresses the fact that men are eating the foods that are most available to them. Here are 4 men. You want to see whether the behavior of any of these 4 men violates this rule. So notice this is not a social contract. It's just purporting to describe how people behave. Right? So the question is, you know, first of all, do people reason well about a social contract even when it's this very, very weird social contract that they've never heard before? And do they reason differently than when it's in a descriptive form, given that it's exactly, the words are all the same? So what we're looking here is the percent of people who choose P, not Q, and no other cards. So in this case, that's a logically correct response. It's also the correct response if you're looking for cheaters. Right? So these are just 2 different experiments, one where it's a rule, and the other one where it's a personal exchange. It doesn't matter. The descriptive rule, the percent of people who choose the logically correct response, it's only about 25%. So it's low, it's like usual. And for the social contract, that's what you get. So it's just like the teenagers borrowing the car rule, except for people have never heard this rule before, right? But they're doing just as well as with the borrowing the car, which they have heard rules like that. Right? And it's a weird rule, but the key thing is that it can be represented as a case of if you take the benefit, then you have to meet the requirement. Right? Okay, another design feature: social contract inference rules should not be the same as the rules of inference of logical inference, like first order logic. So we can ask, in that experiment the correct response if you're detecting cheaters happens to be the logically correct response, you have to ask the question, well, is it the social contract content just activates logical reasoning for some reason? Or does it activate a logic peculiar to social exchange? Well, if you think about it, in logic, it's not valid to say if P then Q does not imply if Q then P. So if I say, you know, if it's a horse, then it's an animal, that doesn't imply if it's an animal, then it's a horse. Right? But in social exchange, if P then Q does imply if Q then P, but only if P is a ration benefit and Q is a requirement. So if I say if you take the benefit, then you're obligated to satisfy the requirement, I do mean, and I am implying, that if you satisfy the requirement, then you're entitled to the benefit. Right? That's not allowed in first order logic. Right? But that should be a natural inference in social exchange. So you can test this. A general form of testing this is you can have, I can say, if you give me your watch, I'll give you $100. Or I can say, if I give you $100, then you give me your watch. I've offered the exact same social contract. And because you have human minds, you recognize that I've basically made the same offer. But technically, from a logical point of view, in the standard form, the benefit if I'm the potential cheater, I would have cheated you if you gave me your watch, P, and I didn't give you the money, not Q. And that would be logically correct. I'd pick P and not Q. These accepting the benefit, not satisfying the requirement. But if the way I happen to have said it was this way, then those same values, you gave me your watch, I did not give you the $100, are Q. Giving you your watch is Q. And me not giving you the money is not P. And that is not a logically correct response. Okay? So the question we're going to ask is, if we take the same problems as before, like the cassava root tattoo problems, those problems, and we just put the benefit into the Q clause instead of into the P clause, in the then clause instead of in the if clause, do we get this logically incorrect response? That's logically incorrect, but it's the right response if you're looking for cheaters. Logical doesn't mean reasonable. It means following the rules of logic. It's not like when Spock says, but Captain, says to Captain Kirk, but Captain. It's just logical. Okay, that's not what I mean by logical. I mean following the rules of logic, right? So what I'm going to show you is social contracts in the switched form, so where the benefit is in the then clause instead of the if clause. So now we're looking for how many people pick Q and not P, which is logically incorrect. When it's a descriptive rule, like what I described before, the descriptive rule that's not a social contract, almost nobody picks it. This is actually 0 people. This is like 1 person. That's a very unusual response for a descriptive rule. When it's a social contract, just as many people pick Q and not P on this one as pick P and not Q on the other one. In other words, a different way of saying it is, the percent of people who pick the benefit accepted and requirement not met cards is the same, regardless of how you say the rule. Whether you say if a man eats cassava root, then he has a tattoo on his face, he must have a tattoo on his face, or if you say if a man has a tattoo on his face, then he eats cassava root. It doesn't matter. They pick the person who took the benefit and the person who did not meet the requirement. Because those are the cards you need to turn over to see if any of those men had cheated. Okay, so they're not just blindly applying formal logic, first order logic. Perfectly happy to violate it when that will detect cheaters. You can ask, does social contract reasoning dissociate from more general forms of reasoning? This has now been replicated in a larger sample, but Vera Malkovich first asked this by looking at people with schizophrenia, positive symptoms of schizophrenia, and hospitalized controls. Because people with schizophrenia are famous for having problems with reasoning, general kinds of reasoning. I mean, everybody has problems with a Wason selection task. That's a descriptive rule, but you can do other kinds of reasoning, like if John is taller than Leda, and well, it's not that way anymore. If John is taller than Nike, my daughter, if Nike is taller than Leda, then you would infer that John is taller than Leda, right? You can give logical problems like that, and to people, general reasoning problems. And the hospitalized controls do well on the general reasoning problems, and they also are good at detecting cheaters on social contracts. Whereas the schizophrenics, they had, as usual, problems with the general reasoning problems, but they were just the same on the social contracts as the normal people were. Hospitalized controls were. There was no difference. They were perfectly good at detecting cheaters. That's telling you something about that. Whatever reasoning procedures or mechanisms are involved in this more general kind of reasoning and that are impaired in schizophrenia, it's not affecting this. So that's interesting. Another design feature, the definition of cheating should depend on your perspective. So this was done by Geert Gigerenzer and Klaus Hug, the same Geert Gigerenzer that you were referring to before with the statistical reasoning. They gave people their subjects a lot of different problems, and so this is an example of one of them, of the social contracts. If an employee is to get a pension, then he must have worked for the firm for over 10 years. Then what he did was, some subjects were cued into the perspective of an employer and some into the perspective of an employee. So in the employer perspective, you were told you're the employer and you're worried that some of your employees may be cheating. In that case, a person, if you think about it, a cheater is somebody who got the pension but did not work for over 10 years, who worked less than 10 years. And that would happen to be P and not Q, right? Which is logically correct. An employee, if you're told you're an employee and you're worried that the employer is cheating employees, look for violations. A violation in that case by the employer would be you've got somebody who worked for more than 10 years but did not get the pension. And that happens to be Q and not P, which is not logically correct. It's logically incorrect. So from the point of view of what social contract theory predicts about cheater detection, in the employer perspective, you'll give a lot of P and not Q answers and very few Q and not Ps. The employee perspective, you should give a lot of Q and not P answers and very few P and not Q ones. Whereas logic and most other theories actually predict a lot of P and not Q and very few Q and not Ps. So the question is, do we see a big X or not in the data? And the answer is, here's a bunch of problems that are from the employer kind of perspective, and here's the ones from the employee perspective. It's a big X. So what counts as, what you're seeing is that what counts as cheating depends on whose perspective you adopt, as it should. And it's computed in a way that depends on the perspective, and you're also seeing the performance is just as good from one perspective as the other. Right? And it's not just that logical reasoning is being activated. Then you can ask, how domain specific is the mechanism? Is it really for social exchange, specialized for that, or is it general to all deontic rules? A deontic rule is a rule that has to do with obligation, entitlement, or prohibition. Right? So for example, Cheng and Holyoke, some cognitive psychologists, had suggested that what people really have is a permission schema that has these 4 production rules in it. If an action is to be taken, then the precondition must be satisfied. If the action is not to be taken, then the precondition need not be satisfied. If the precondition is satisfied, then the action may be taken. If the precondition is not satisfied, then the action must not be taken. If you apply those rules, you'll end up choosing on the Wason task the action to be taken card and the precondition not satisfied card to see if to look for violations. Now notice that the domain of permission rules is bigger than the domain of social contracts, because all social contracts are permission rules. They all fit that framework. If an action is to be taken, then the precondition must be met. But social contracts regulate access to benefits. But not all permission rules are social contracts. So there's lots of rules that are just puzzling in the world. I find puzzling. You know. So it used to be, before everything was on email, it used to be at my university, there used to be a rule that said, if you're writing an inter-office memo, it must be on blue paper. I don't know why, but that was a rule. It had to be on blue paper. That's not a social contract. It's just a rule about how, you know, if you eat red meat, then you drink red wine. There's lots of rules in the world that are permission rules, but they're not social contracts. So some permission rules are not social contracts. So we can use this fact to test for a design feature. The benefit should matter, and to test whether what we're seeing is good reasoning for any permission rule or specifically for social contracts. So again, a fictitious culture in which the elders have made laws governing what adolescents are allowed to do, and in this case, and all of these rules fit the template. If one is to take action A, then one must satisfy precondition R. In the first one, it said, so the context was held constant, but we just varied a couple of words in the rule. So in one case, the rule was, if one is going out at night, then one must tie a small piece of red volcanic rock around one's ankle. The second one, there's only two words that differ. If one is staying home at night, then one must tie a small piece of red volcanic rock around one's ankle. Here we wanted to, you know, among undergraduates, going out at night, that's fun, right? That's sex, drugs, and rock and roll, right? Staying home is kind of neutral or boring. You know, taking out the garbage, if you have to do chores, that's even worse, right? So we wanted to, one is if one's taking out the garbage, then you have to tie a small piece of red volcanic rock around one's ankle. So all three of these are permission rules. They all fit this template, all of them, right? But only, given how teenagers and undergraduates see going out at night as a benefit or a privilege, only the first one regulates access to a benefit and is therefore a social contract. So the question is, do we see good performance for all three of those rules, or just for the first one? And here's the answer. When it's a benefit, 80% of the subjects were getting it right, but then you get this big drop, 30 percentage point drop in performance for the neutral and even more for the chore one. This is just a problem with a similar structure, having it's set in the Sears, never mind. You can do the same thing with a different problem and get the same kind of results. So benefits matter. So how domain specific is a mechanism? It does not detect the violation of all permission rules, of all deontic rules, of all social norms. The benefit results rule out the permission schema theory, certain deontic theories that have been put forth, the idea that it's general to all rules involving obligation, entitlement, and prohibition. And it rules out the idea that what you're seeing here is just a mechanism for detecting violations of social norms, because it works for some rules, the ones that are social contract, and not for other ones. Can general skill acquisition explain the results? You might think from an economic perspective, or just any common sense, any skill perspective. You might think that people would be good at detecting violations of social contracts no matter what. Okay? You might think that people are good at detecting cheating events, and that the reason for the violation might be irrelevant. Why? Well, because on the intuition that you become skilled at solving any problem that you're motivated to solve, such as those with economic consequences, when a social contract is violated, the person who provided the benefit suffers a loss in utility. So if those cases are detected, the victim could recoup the loss, get what he's owed. And you might think that a lifetime of not getting what you're entitled to, or seeing people not getting what they're entitled to, should build skill at detecting violations of social contracts, that is, cheating events in which somebody's been cheated for whatever reason. But you can ask the question, is the mechanism designed to look for cheaters, that is, individuals with a disposition to cheat, or to events in which a social contract has been violated, cases in which someone has been cheated? These may seem like the same thing, but they are not necessarily. From the point of view of evolutionary game theory, the evolution of reciprocity requires the ability to avoid cooperating with designs that cheat, with individuals, with agents that violate social contracts by virtue of their programs or by virtue of the way they're calibrated, by disposition, who have a disposition to cheat, right? That's why in things like tit for tat and so forth will invade a population of individuals that always defect or always cheat and won't be exploited, et cetera. So that it predicts you'll be looking that the mechanism will be designed for detecting cheaters, individuals who with a disposition to cheat, a form of person categorization, not necessarily event categorization. Because even a cooperator may sometimes fail to reciprocate by mistake. We all make mistakes. We might forget to reciprocate. We might not be able to in a particular case. There are lots of reasons that don't involve a disposition to cheat that might result in an event in which somebody was cheated. They didn't get what they're entitled to, right? And it would be a fitness error to avoid that individual who merely made a mistake, because they might be a very good cooperator, right? And if you avoided them, you'd be losing the opportunity to get harvest all kinds of benefits in life by associating with them, if you just avoided them just because they made a mistake. So it's important to distinguish between somebody who's cheating by virtue of a disposition to cheat versus an innocent mistake. Okay, you got all that. So let's see what happens when there's accidental cheating, or so a cheater is an agent who takes a benefit but fails to meet the provisioner's requirement and does it by intention or calibration rather than by mistake or accident. Okay, so to test this, we did 2 series of experiments, and we used the exact same social contract rule in all of the conditions. So we held constant the fact that the rule was a social contract. Okay? And we're going to see, do we see differences in how good people are at detecting violations of social contracts as a function of whether it's intentional or accidental. So what we varied is whether the potential violator gets the benefit specified in the rule, would they get it or not? And was the potential violator acting intentionally or making innocent mistakes? And in the second series of experiments, we also varied whether the situation made it possible to violate the rule. I'll explain that in a second. So we used exactly the same rule. If a student is to be assigned to Dover High School, then that student must live in Dover City. The context explains that Dover High School is a good school, Hanover High is not a good school. People living in Dover City pay high taxes to support this good school. People living in Hanover and other cities don't pay high taxes, even though they're equally prosperous. The Board of Education took these factors into account when creating this rule, and you supervise volunteers at the Board of Education who are sorting students' documents and who are supposed to be implementing this rule, right? So it has this form. You would be looking, the correct answer would be looking for somebody assigned to Dover High School to see if they live in a city other than Dover City, and somebody who lives in the town of Hanover to see if they were assigned to Dover High School. Always a social contract. What varied in this first one is the potential rule violator. So in the cheater condition, the people who are working at the Board of Education are mothers with high school age children who volunteer to sort the documents at the local Board of Education. Some may have sorted their own children's documents. Some may have cheated. Look to see whether any of these cases violate the rule. The sabotage condition is interesting because you're supervising these women and they're mad at you for having fired their best friend. So these women, they intend to violate the rule because they want to make chaos to make you look incompetent in the eyes of your boss. So there they have the intention to violate the rule, but they don't get a benefit directly. They don't get the benefit specified in the rule of a child in Dover High School. In the innocent mistake condition, the people sorting the documents they're kind of absent-minded elderly ladies. They work at the Board of Education, and they're sorting the documents, and they may have made some mistakes. Look for violations of the rule. So there's no intention to violate, and they don't get any benefit from violating the rule. So the question is, are you good at detecting violations of social contracts no matter what the reason for the violation, or does it matter? And the answer is, and these are identical social contract rules, you're good when the potential violators are cheaters, people with the intention to violate, and who would have got the benefit in the rule. In the sabotage condition, it drops by about 20 points, and in the mistake condition, it drops by another 20 points. Then we did a full parametric design where we varied whether the benefit to the violator is present or absent, like I just described, whether the intention to violate is present or absent, and then the third thing we did was whether the ability to cheat is present or absent. So does a situation make it difficult, like having redacted documents where it would make it hard to see? Because if you think about it, if the situation makes cheating difficult, then looking for cheaters is not likely to reveal people with a disposition to cheat if it's just hard to cheat in that situation. So the hypothesis is you're looking for individuals with a disposition to cheat. Here's what you get. We did the full parametric design. Each of those things was independently varied. When all three factors, benefit, intention, and ability, are there, you get the full response as always. If you take out any one of those things and leave the other two, it drops by 40 points. If you take out two of those things and leave one of them, it drops by another 20 points to the same level as if you have none of them. And it's same as for any descriptive rule. So you're seeing a step function, right? So each of those components contributes to the effect, right? And there are components that you would expect if there's a disposition. The mechanism is looking for individuals with a disposition to cheat. This rules out a million theories. Blah, blah, blah. Let me just, okay. I get excited about all the theories it rules out, but let me just go on. Let me just go on to, okay. Okay, so looking for cheating by design, not by mistake. It suggests the mechanism is very functionally designed to look for cheaters, individuals with a disposition to cheat. And you can ask just how specialized is that mechanism, and it's just so freaking specialized, I can't even believe it sometimes. Okay, what about other rules? Precautionary rules, like if you work with toxic gases, then you have to wear a gas mask. People are actually good at looking for violations of precautionary rules. That would be somebody who's working with toxic gases and not wearing a gas mask. They elicit good violation detection. Somebody who's engaged in the hazardous activity but has not taken the appropriate precaution. People are good at that. And that's an important kind of adaptive problem. You know, checking to see if somebody's in danger by virtue of not having taken a precaution. So again, you can ask how domain specific is the mechanism. Precautionary rules are permission rules. All social contracts are permission rules. All precautionary rules are permission rules. There are permission rules that are neither social contracts nor precautions. We already know that those do not elicit good violation detection because I showed you that with the benefit results. Social contracts regulate access to benefits, whereas precautionary rules say what you should do to avoid harm. So you can ask the question, is there one mechanism for these two domains, or are there two different mechanisms? Are there two functionally distinct mechanisms? If there was only a single mechanism that was governing reasoning about precautionary rules and social contracts, then if you damage that mechanism, it should impair performance on both kinds of problems. Okay? Just like if you break a radio, it won't play any of the stations. On the other hand, if there's one mechanism that's well designed for looking for cheaters on social contracts and another one that's well designed for looking to see if people are in danger by virtue of having broken a precautionary rule, in principle you could have brain damage that affects one and not the other. So with Valerie Stone, we looked at patient RM. He had damage bilaterally to his orbital frontal cortex, to his anterior temporal lobes, and the damage to his temporal poles was so severe that both of his amygdalas were disconnected from his temporal lobes. He'd actually, ironically, he had been riding a bike without a helmet, failing to take a precaution when he's riding a bike, and that's how he got his brain damage. It turns out, though, that he reasons normally about precautionary rules, but he has difficulty detecting cheaters on social contracts. So when you give a set of precautionary rules and social contracts to normal control subjects, they do equally well on the two. When you give them to RM, he does just as well on the on the precautionary rules as these guys do, but he has a huge deficit on detecting cheaters. 31 percentage points, huge. We looked at some other people with overlapping but not the same patterns of brain damage. He had the 31-point deficit. They had no deficit at all. Does the cheater detection routine develop cross-culturally? It was already known. Don't worry, I'm getting close to the end of results. We had already found the same pattern, not we, lots of people had found the same pattern of reasoning in Western industrialized countries, US, Britain, Germany, France, Hong Kong, Italy, Japan. But what about non-industrial societies? Places that don't engage in as much market exchange as we do. You could think, well, maybe the fact that we engage in market exchange all the time, somehow builds cheater detection subroutines. And maybe if you're not engaging in so much market exchange like we do, maybe you don't. So Larry Sugiyama, our former student and now a professor at University of Oregon, he was studying Shiviar people. I'm not mispronouncing Shuar. These are different people, in case you're wondering. Shiviar people, they're in a similar part of the Ecuadorian Amazon, in the Rio Pastaza area in eastern Ecuador. They're hunter horticulturalists. and we adapted the task for a non-literate, non-Western population. And you can't test something in every single population. Some don't exist anymore. You can't go to ancient Greece and test Socrates, or but what you can do is test things in a place that's different on as many dimensions as possible, as the place you've been testing it. And this is a very different cultural setting. So this is a Shivyar gentleman in his hut. This is one of the villages. What you're seeing here is Amazon tree canopy. These villages are cut into the forest. They're so hard to get to. The rivers are unnavigable most of the year. They're so hard to get to that a pilot has to drop you in a bush plane to get there. It's very hard to get there. It doesn't mean that they have no contact with the Western world. There's nobody anymore on Earth that has never had contact with the Western world. But they're living in a very different situation. They hunt, they garden, they sometimes use rifles, sometimes blowguns. They have a different way of life than your typical undergraduate in California. There were no people that we could find who spoke both English and Shivyar, so it had to be translated English to Spanish and Spanish to Shivyar, and then of course back translated to make sure you're correct. And we did a version where we used photographs, and there's little doors that you can open. So this would be a case where if there's a red flower on top, then there's a blue butterfly below, and you show a bunch of these cards. You say like this, and you say which door would you need to open. If you showed it like this, you'd say, do you need to open this door to see if this violates the rule? Would you need to open, if you saw this, would you need to open this door to see what violates the rule? You see, so this would always be P under this one. This would always be Q or not Q on that one. So we made a version that would be easier because it was just visual like that. You don't have to read to do it. And Larry Sugiyama gave this to Shivyar people, and he gave them a descriptive rule, a standard social contract where the correct answer is P and not Q, and a switch social contract where the correct answer is Q and not P. Okay? So this is Shivyar villagers versus Harvard undergraduates. These are the cheater relevant cards. So this is the benefit accepted card, which with a standard social contract is P, and on a switch social contract that's Q. Remember I showed you that before. And this is the requirement not met card, which in the standard social contract is not Q, so standard is P and not Q. And on a switch social contract, it's not P, it falls into the logical category, not P, so on the switch one, the right answer is Q and not P. That's cheaters. What you're seeing here is when it comes to cheater relevant cards, is the cheater or not, the Shivyar are as good as Harvard undergraduates, they're actually 1 percentage point better. So it shows you when it comes to an important task, it shows you the value of a Harvard education, which is now their performance is not identical because they did show more interest in the cheater irrelevant cards. But what you can do is you can hold the logical category constant, because we had standard and switch social contracts. You can hold the logical category constant and look at how often do they choose that card when it's cheater relevant versus cheater irrelevant. So blue is and yellow is cheater irrelevant, and so the P card is cheater relevant. It's a benefit accepted for the standard one. It's the requirement is met for the switched one. You see what I mean by cheater relevant? So the yellow ones represent people who could not possibly have cheated. These represent cards of. So what you're seeing is when you hold logical category constant, they were always more likely to pick the card when it was relevant to detecting cheaters than it was not. And it was sort of interesting because on these cheater relevant cards, they often expressed interest in whether the person was generous or a kin member. They said things like, well, this guy, one of them was, if you use my motorboat, then you have to bring me a basket of fish or something like this. And they say, well, this guy who brought the basket of fish, maybe he didn't use a motorboat because he's the brother of the guy whose motorboat it is. And they really wanted to see sometimes, they expressed interest in generosity or altruism in a way that the Harvard undergraduates just were not interested. So basically, you're just seeing that when it comes to cheater relevant cards, people are very buffered against cultural variation. When it comes to interest in being generous or altruistic, you're seeing more cultural variation. Okay. So adaptations are aspects of the phenotype that were designed by natural selection. So what counts as evidence? in evolutionary biology, to show that an aspect of the phenotype is an adaptation, you have to produce evidence that it's well designed for solving an adaptive problem that the species faced in the past. So, for example, to say that an organism has cognitive procedures that are adaptations for detecting cheaters, you have to show that the procedures are well designed for detecting cheaters on social contracts, and you also have to show that those design features are not explained more parsimoniously as byproducts or side effects of cognitive processes that evolved to solve some other kind of problem or some more general class of problem. So what evidence do we have so far of special design? The cognitive programs that are governing cheating, reasoning about social contracts have these design features. All of these were predicted in advance of any data. They operate even in unfamiliar situations. They embody implicational procedures that are specific to the analysis of how social exchange has to go, like concepts of entitlement and obligation, like understanding that if you take the benefit, then you're obligated to meet the requirement, implies that if you meet the requirement, then you're entitled to the benefit. They have procedures specialized for cheater detection. The procedures are neurally dissociable from other forms of reasoning. They're found cross-culturally. The definition of cheating they embody is content dependent. It's accepting a benefit without satisfying the requirement. It's perspective dependent. These cheater detection procedures cannot detect violations of social contracts when that's unlikely to reveal a cheater. It's not that it detects innocent mistakes or other events where somebody didn't get what they're entitled to. It's looking for people with a disposition to cheat. It doesn't operate so as to detect cheaters unless the rule's been assigned, mentally assigned, the cost-benefit structure of a social contract. If you take away the benefit, the effect goes away. They're just as good at the mechanisms at computing that cost-benefit representation from one perspective as from the other perspective. And it turns out, I didn't show you this, but Paul Harris and Maria Nunez have shown that there's precocial competence. You can give an easier form of this task to 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds. They know exactly what counts as cheating, as violating, when it's a social contract, violating that. If you give them a descriptive rule, they don't know what counts as a violation. If you give a 5-year-old just a full-blown weights and selection task, and they'll do very well. And also, people don't seem to be good at detecting altruists. I didn't show you that, but that's what we found. You also want to eliminate side effect hypotheses, byproduct hypotheses, and a bunch of them, every one that we know of, is inconsistent with the data, has been eliminated. So familiarity alone cannot explain the social contract effects. Logic, just the rote application of logic cannot explain it. So it's not that it just activates social contracts, just activate the application of rules of inference of predicate calculus, propositional calculus. A content-independent deontic logic cannot explain those effects, so it's not a permission schema or any other kind of deontic theory, because people aren't good at them when they're not social contracts and also when they're not precautions. Social contract content doesn't merely afford clear thinking. It's not that you just suddenly can think clearly when it's a social contract, because I showed you the innocent mistake experiments. Same social contract, same interpretation of the rule. This one would take me an hour to explain, but relevance theory can't explain it. And the mere presence of payoffs doesn't elicit the detection of violations, which you also saw with the innocent mistake. So no content-independent, domain general blank slate type theory that's been proposed so far can explain the social contract effects, the particular pattern that we found. So far it looks like the human mind contains a neurocognitive adaptation that's functionally specialized for reasoning about social exchange, which includes a subroutine for detecting cheaters. And it seems to reliably develop in the human cognitive architecture in a species typical manner. That is, it seems to be so far a component of what you can think of as human nature. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
Sure.
This is really great what you showed us. Very respectfully, I'd like to share some criticism.
You'd like to what?
To share some criticism.
Yes, go ahead.
Respectfully, because great work. I really admire how much you've done with this, and it's really great evidence. But with such great evidence, it seems hard for me to understand why root explanations about this on a computational theory of mind. Because a computational theory of mind is just too powerful I mean, anything can be explained, and to restrict it to even account for mind, even if we reduce mind to the formal properties of the nervous system. And then there's some stronger statements than that about modularity and logic, in the sense that social interchange seems here to be governed by, well, not second order logic, not first order logic, but some other kind of logic. Mm-hmm. And evidence shows us that actual human activity more approximates these models than actually be governed by them. With any kind of logic, any change produces these very wild variations, but in human life, people vary very little among them in time. Processes seem to be more multinomial in this sense, so I don't understand at which level mental processes are computer programs here, or why is it necessary for the explanation?
Okay. When you say a computational theory of mind or the computational theory of mind, I don't know what you mean. All I mean is that the brain does computations of some sort, that it processes information, and that one wants to understand the representations it uses, the inference procedures it uses, what information it stores, how it transforms the information, how it extracts information. That's what I mean by when I talk about understanding the computation. So I don't think of there being the computational theory of mind. I think of it being just like you would ask of your laptop what programs is in it, what programs are in it. When I hit the delete key, what does that do? Does that do the same thing in different programs or different things in different programs? The input-output relations, and how do you explain what's the transformation from input to output? That's what I mean. So the neural instantiation, all of this is going to be done by neural tissue, but I don't see that there's anything that's known about neural tissue that prohibits any particular kind of program from existing. And if you look across species, clearly different species do not behave in the same way.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, you just look at social systems in primates. You have gorillas where there's a single male mating polygynously with several females, but each of those females is mating monogamously with a male. You have chimpanzees that are mating with, the females are mating with everybody, and the males are trying their best to mate with everybody. You have TT monkeys that are monogamous. All of these things, there's all neural tissue in all of these cases, but clearly their social behavior is very, very different in all of these species. And so that. Secondly, what I showed you is that, and this is developed more in one of our papers, that a domain general deontic logic cannot explain the results. Because, for example, if it was really domain general, and it wasn't about benefits and costs, requirements, and it wasn't about looking for people with a disposition to cheat, in the case where I'm holding social contract content constant, you ought to be good at detecting violations of that rule across the board, because the interpretation of the rule is exactly the same. We held the interpretation of the rule on any deontic logic. The interpretation of the rule is identical, but whether people are good at detecting violations or not varied very systematically with a feature that is predicted in advance by evolutionary game theory. So we tested against all those sorts of theories, and so far none of them have held up. The reason this has taken 25 years is because every time somebody produces a new alternative theory, we try to test against it. Right? So if somebody produces a theory that is more general than what we've proposed about social contracts, then we'd have to do the test. We'd have to test.
That's great, but what I mean is that the limits of computing, I mean, mm-hmm. whatever it is that we think is the program here, it must be subject, if it's a program, to the limits of computing, the limits of the Turing-Hawking to Gödel's theorem, and even if Gödel's theorem seems too far from this, Wittgenstein's account of the problems of computer models, even when people communicate, seem to seem to make a computer model too restrictive. I mean, the idea that there's a program governing it, just too restrictive to...
This doesn't understand anything I'm saying, this table. It's making no inferences. A 3-pound bowl of oatmeal that's the same weight as my brain, it doesn't make inferences. Carrots don't make inferences. Animals make inferences. Whatever it is that makes it different, that's what I mean by a program that processes information. The reason why you can have what Wittgenstein's talking about, and lots of different interpretations of the same, of what seems to be the same concept or what may be different concepts, is because of the structure of the mind. We have lots of different domain-specific inference engines in our brains. There's the theory of mind system for making inferences about behavior based on people's beliefs and their desires and intentions. There's an object mechanics system for that embodies a kind of billiard ball causality that infants have. Infants know that objects exist in the world even when they're hidden, and that two solid objects can't pass through one another. At 2 months of age, they know that. There seem to be inference systems that have to do with intuitive biology, what it means to be alive or not. There are a lot of these different inference systems, and they are what allow, I would argue, that they are what allow us to understand Spiel game in lots of different ways. That's the thing that Wittgenstein's not seeing, is the undergirding of human nature that's allowing all these inferences to happen. So if you want to call it, if you don't want to call it computations, you can call it anything you want. I'm just saying that the mind is there, the brain's there to process information, and I'm trying to understand the procedures by which it's processing it, and I'm trying to understand them not just at a neural level, like that this neuron's connected to this neuron, because that doesn't tell me what it's there to do.
Thanks. Any questions?
Do you think that this ability, this gene detecting ability, is more general than, or could be more generalized, like some sort of justice-seeking ability that we share among humans, and even go a step further and take this evolutionary psychology project into comparative psychology? So let's go with genes and even before Wallman. Could I find some gene detector mechanism in your life?
It would have to be a species that engages in social exchange, and a lot of species don't engage in social exchange. For a species that does engage in social exchange, like the vampire bats, I mean, they do cooperate with kin a lot of the time, but sometimes the individuals that they share blood. They go hunting. There's a lot of variance in whether you get blood from an animal or not. If you don't have a meal in 3 or 4 days, you die as a vampire bat. So what they do is, and there's a lot of variance in whether of luck about whether you get blood or not. So what they do is, if one gets, they have these nests where they have some nest mates. Some are sisters and some are not sisters. These are females. And what they do is, the one that gets blood in a given night, if the other ones don't get blood, they beg, and then she vomits blood into the mouth of the other ones. Very sweet. And then roles get reversed, so they pool risk. Now, they would need to have ability to detect cheaters, individuals who are not reciprocating, right? But it doesn't need to be the exact same procedure. It could be very blood specific. It could be that if I see a well-nourished nestmate and I ask for blood and I don't get it, that's when I tag them as a cheater. It doesn't have to be at this abstract level. So you could imagine, in baboons, you could imagine that they have a system for keeping track of who grooms who, like grooming for grooming. You could imagine there are some primates that do meat for sex. And they could have some very specific systems for specific goods that they trade. Humans, I thought it would be a more abstract level of representation, because it's a very strange thing about humans that we're able to exchange almost anything. And I assume that that's partly because we have the ability to make and use tools and improvise novel solutions to problems. So yes, any species that engages in reciprocity, it really can't evolve unless there's some mechanism for cooperating with other cooperators and avoiding cooperating with cheaters. And so there should be a mechanism. It doesn't have to be exactly the same one as in humans. And so yes, there's a comparative psychology program that one can do. And the other one, justice and I think it's part of. I think people do think it's unjust when they've helped people a lot, a person a lot, and they ask for something simple in return and the person refuses to help them, yes, I think it's unjust. There can be lots of things that people think are unjust that go beyond this. So there's an interesting field that's developing of moral psychology, and I would never want to say that moral psychology is only this, right? Because there's a lot of different kinds of, what sharing rules do you use when variance is due to bad luck versus effort, like when somebody's, like in hunting, where you may come back with nothing on a lot of days. People tend to share widely anything they have, whereas if it's low variance and it's due to just not trying, they don't share widely, they just use reciprocation. I think that's part of how people think about fairness and justice. I think that's a very interesting question, and there's starting to be a lot of research on it. But I don't want to say that this is the only thing. This is a little piece of it.
Question? Well, I have a question.
Yes.
It's related with math education, science education.
Yes.
Think of a mathematician, and our director is a mathematician. I would bet that he think that we have some general reason ability, this would apply to math, that is content independent. You rule out such possibility, or this general reasoning is somehow a mixture of specific reasoning mechanism? So what is...
Okay, so if you think about rules of first order logic, modus ponens is if P then Q is true, P is true, therefore Q is true, for example. It looks like our minds really do have a procedure like that works across domains, modus ponens.
At least mathematicians should have one.
Mathematicians better have that, right? They better come to that conclusion. Modus tollens, you say, if P then Q is true, Q is false, therefore P is false. People are very bad at that one. That's what you need to falsify. Like if you're a Popperian, if you're Karl Popper and you want to put forth a hypothesis and look for violations of that hypothesis, we're not good at that. That's what the Wason task was initially. Peter Wason wanted to know if everyday learning was a form of Popperian hypothesis testing, where you look for violations of rules. And he found that people are not good at looking for violations of rules. It's not clear whether we have any modus tollens rule or if it's just certain conditions activate it or not. What you would expect is if there are some general, I'm not trying to rule out the existence of all content-free procedures, but you have to ask on a case-by-case basis, is this procedure there, is this procedure there, is this procedure there? And what I do think is that you want a mind that's designed so that when there's a specific domain, that it preempts these other procedures. So if there's cues that this is a social contract, you want to shut down those procedures and use the ones that are specialized for social exchange. Because when you have content-rich inference systems, you could make inferences that you could, if you restricted the design of the mind to inference procedures that can apply validly across all domains, it would be a very computationally weak mind. So for example, when I look at a person's behavior, I think that if I see you walk to the water fountain, I think, oh, he wants water, and he thinks that there's water in that fountain. And that's an explanation of your behavior. When I see a rock roll down a hill, I don't say, oh, the rock wants to be, I know Aristotle said things like that, but I don't say, oh, the rock's rolling down the hill because the rock wants to be at the bottom of the hill and it believes it can get something at the bottom of the hill. I apply an object mechanics mechanism to understanding that. If you really wanted a truly domain general content-free mind, you'd have to take out all those inferences that have to do with mental states and intentions and beliefs, because they don't apply to rocks. You can apply physics to the people, like if you shove somebody off of a roof, they will fall in a Newtonian way, right? But you can't apply, you won't make good inferences if you apply a belief-desire psychology to rocks and trees. So a truly domain general mind as a whole would lose all these rich inference procedures that can fill in the gaps and make inferences that are not warranted by the data that you have, but that are likely to be true in a given domain. And so I think a design feature of the mind should be that insofar as there are content-free procedures, that when there's evidence of an adaptively important content domain for which you have mechanisms that are specially designed, those cues should preempt the more general ones so that the more specific system takes control. Because if you think about these results, if you were just to apply in a mechanical way first order logic to these problems, you would fail. You would not detect cheaters in a whole bunch of cases. You'd be doing worse from an adaptive point of view. So that's my, so I can't answer as a general thing. There's some research that we've done, and that Gerrit Gigerenzer has done on statistical reasoning about risk and probability. In that work, we find that the format of the information, like whether it's put in terms of frequencies or probabilities of single events, that makes a huge difference. But we haven't found too many content effects where it matters what kinds of things. As long as they're whole objects, people are pretty good at applying, thinking about hit rates and false alarm rates and things like that, as long as you put in a frequency. So I don't see any content effects there. With this reasoning, this kind of reasoning, there's content effects everywhere.
So is there some hope that after all those years of schooling and university, somehow this relative will have a little bit better reasoning ability than the rest?
After the schooling?
Yeah.
Well, I hope so, but you know what? I think that probably there's not such a thing. Sometimes people want to teach reasoning in general, apart from some particular domain. And my guess is that it's going to be a lot easier to teach people, especially to get them to think about falsification in the context of particular domains. I think you have to have things to think about when you're teaching people what counts as good reasoning, that there needs to be a rich domain that you're having them think about. That's my guess about it, that just reasoning in general is going to be hard. There's also the case, Dan Sperber's done research on this, he thinks that logical reasoning really gets activated when you need to judge the creedal value of what somebody else is saying, whether what somebody's saying is, I should believe it. So if Alvaro's telling me things, should I believe what Alvaro's telling me? Should I not believe what he's telling me? And he's shown that the same logical inferences that people are usually not good at, they're much better at if you put it in the context of an argument between two people. So where one person's trying to convince you of something, suddenly you become a logician. I mean, suddenly you become a falsificationist. If Alvaro's telling me things that that sound a little funny, I suddenly will say, wait a minute. But but this guy, who is forgetful, this guy who's not forgetful, he didn't have Ebbinghaus disease. Well, suddenly I'll be doing that modus tollens kind of inference. So it might help to be teaching logical reasoning in the context of arguments, for example, debates, having kids debate about things, and so on. Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much.
My pleasure. Oh, my pleasure.